From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up today, K-State's Mykel Taylor will offer an updated view on agricultural land value trends in Kansas and if those have been affected by the economic disruptions from the pandemic. She'll also address some of the changes in how farm and ranch land purchases are taking place these days. Also, K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz checks in to talk about applying anhydrous ammonia to corn ground here in the fall in advance of planting next spring. And on this week's Wildlife Management segment, K-State's Charlie Lee reports on proposed changes to how the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is enforced here in the U.S. All that and more right here on Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, coming once again from the campus of Kansas State University. Thanks for joining us. Always topical, agricultural land value trends in the state of Kansas. And our guest recently shared the latest information that she's pulled together on agricultural land values at the K-State Agricultural Lenders Conference. And we've asked her to come by and pass along those same observations to us right here. Mykel Taylor, agricultural economist, K-State Research and Extension. She's been reviewing, examining, studying land value trends in Kansas for a long, long while. Mykel, to the point of interest here, what's the latest as far as those trends go? Do we see major shifts since the start of 2020?
So that's been the real question for a lot of folks, is whether or not the onset of COVID has adversely affected land values in the state of Kansas, so since about March on. And I have access to data from the Property Valuation Department in Topeka, which are actual land transactions, and I've looked at those data for land sales since about March or early part of 2020, and haven't seen a decline in average land values for farmland and pasture. Holding steady, basically, is where we're at on those land values, which is a good sign. You know, we didn't have a big contraction in the land market due to people being concerned about the future of ag, or a big contraction due to cash flow situation. It's really held steady.
And we must keep in mind that if we see movements in farm and ranch land values, they're at a glacial pace. They don't shift dramatically. So that's
right.
To be noted here.
So we look for small movements. Try not to read too much into it, because we know that land values, when we buy land, we buy it with very long-run expectations in mind. But I think that people were concerned that the COVID would hinder auctions, and that you would have auction companies essentially closing down the number of people that could show up, or that people wouldn't show up for these auctions, and that would affect the number of bidders and therefore the price of land. And that just hasn't happened. In visiting with some of these auction companies around the state, what they've done for the most part is substitute for online auctions as opposed to local auctions. And the online auction format allows you to bring in out-of-state bidders, out-of-county, out-of-state bidders to that ground. And in many cases, you're seeing just a shift away from local bidders to people from Nebraska, Missouri, Oklahoma, in some cases Wisconsin, Georgia, quite a ways away, but they're looking at Kansas land as a good investment and an opportunity. And so with that sort of backfilling of bidders from out of state, then you haven't seen that downward pressure on land value prices.
And that brings up other questions about those out-of-state purchasers of agricultural land. Do they instantly become absentee landowners, or are they actively farming that newly acquired land in their own right? So there's a lot of spin-off to this.
Sure. I assume that in most cases, these folks are going to end up being absentee landowners as opposed to necessarily coming in and farming the ground themselves. But that's possible. What's always interesting to me is that, sometimes Kansas farmland looks like a heck of a deal when you compare it to, say, the Corn Belt in terms of the dollar per acre. But we have a lot more risk in our production side of things with regard to weather and such. So it's always interesting to me when out-of-state buyers are looking at land as to just what kind of background they have with Kansas farmland, and what that's going to do. But I think that most of them are going to become absentee landowners and looking for a local farmer to farm that land.
And that then has repercussions as far as the local economies. Once more, there's more to the story.
Yeah, there's always the possibility. I've talked with people who are actually kind of concerned about this issue, who run like community foundations, who depend a lot on donations from local people. And when the land is not owned by somebody local who turns around and reinvests in that community, when it's owned by somebody out of state, I think it decreases the probability that they're going to invest in that local community. And so there is some concern that if you have an influx of out-of-state or out-of-area landowners, that might adversely affect giving. So it's a wrinkle.
But it's not a new phenomenon.
It's not a new phenomenon, not at all. Absentee land ownership has grown, and it's not necessarily because out-of-state people have come in buying land. It's happened more because people have inherited land and they don't live on the farm anymore. They're kids or grandkids of the farmland owners, and they live in Kansas City or they live out of state. So I think that's been a bigger driver of absentee landowners than necessarily having out-of-state people coming in and buying land.
Back to the main question of land value trends and the fact that those are holding up quite well, those values. Part of this also has to do with income stability and then what's supporting that.
Right. So I think you have to look at where net farm and ranch income has been over the last couple of years and kind of understand the drivers there, because a lot of or a big chunk of net farm and ranch income in 2018-19 and as well in 2020 is going to be ad hoc government payments. So this is MFP payments, the market facilitation payments, and then this year coming from the legislation being driven by the coronavirus to support farmers. And that ad hoc government payment has given a really solid base to incomes over the last few years that otherwise would have been very volatile and pretty low. And so for farmers who are not in a bad financial situation as a result of the China trade war or coronavirus, if they're doing okay, then those government payments represent additional cash on hand that they can use to bid on ground if it comes up in their area and it's a good piece of ground.
Mm-hmm. Again, though, those are ad hoc payments, presumably not to last in perpetuity. In fact, when the pandemic does come to an end, and so too one would think with those payment structures, what would that mean to income and therefore land values and bidding tendencies?
I think there's still the potential for some softening in the land market if we lose these ad hoc payments. And I think it's going to come one of potentially two ways. One is that the pandemic ends and there's no political push to give farmers more money on these ad hoc payments. And then the second is the outcome of the election. And from a political standpoint, who's in office and how much push do they have or incentive do they have to give farmers anything beyond what the Farm Bill will give them. And so you have the potential to lose a pretty significant chunk of farm and ranch income in 2021 and 2022. And we may not see commodity prices recover sufficiently to make that up. So a lot of uncertainty going forward. As there's been a lot of uncertainty for the last several years, but I think we're going to continue to see that uncertainty. And I think that the land markets will continue to be sort of in flux as a result of that uncertainty. And so there's definitely the possibility that land values could fall a little bit more, and it wouldn't eat away the total amount of appreciation that we saw over that period from 2008 to 2014. We saw tremendous appreciation in land values. We haven't lost all of that appreciation by any stretch. So there's still room for those land values to come down a little bit more, and we still are in a better position than we were when this run started.
And that's been the remarkable thing amidst all of this the last several years, particularly with commodity prices, grain prices declining so substantially. We did not see that precipitous dive in land values, and that doesn't seem to be in the cards here either for hopefully the foreseeable future.
Right. I think it helps net farm and ranch incomes being high due to government payments and low interest rates help the situation. And just in talking to some bankers, they say that a lot of the bidding on land by farmers has been done with cash. And that tells me that there were guys that during that 2008 to 2014 period where we were just booming in terms of incomes, that they weren't growing at that point in time. They weren't buying land when it was going up by so much every year. And instead they were sort of holding out. And now they're in a cash strong position to be able to bid on that ground. So we have a real mixed bag. When you look at the distribution of incomes across farms in the Kansas Farm Management Association database, the average net farm income, I think, last year was right around $100,000. But the distribution around that is very wide. Mm-hmm. And so you have a lot of people who are losing money, but you've got some people who are in strong positions. And so that average can be a little bit deceiving.
So much revolves around agricultural land values of importance to lending patterns and the basic solvency of the agricultural economy here in the state of Kansas. It's always good to check up on what's happening with those land value trends, and we appreciate you coming by and helping us do just that, Mykel. Many thanks.
Happy to do so. Thank you.
Agricultural economist Mykel Taylor, K-State Research and Extension. Again, she addressed land value trends in Kansas agriculture at that recent Agricultural Lenders Conference hosted by K-State Research and Extension. Additionally, for anyone interested, K-State Agricultural Economics has extensive resources on agricultural land buying and valuing and farm and ranch land rental rates, all of that easily accessed at the agmanager.info website, agmanager.info. And we'll be back with more for you after this break. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Agriculture Today is back now. And for you corn producers, we've thoughts on nutrient management to consider now as we're well into the fall. The prospects of applying anhydrous ammonia well in advance of next spring's corn planting. There's value in that tactic, we're told now, by our guest. He's a crop nutrient specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. There are very good reasons, as a matter of fact, to think about getting that anhydrous down this early, you say, Dorivar.
Yes, Eric, we do have many advantages of doing applications of anhydrous in the fall. Of course, can help us with the workload basically in the spring, have all of that fertilizer basically ready for next year. However, there are some considerations when we are doing anhydrous application in the fall. There are some situations where we can have a risk of losing some of that nitrogen. So we have to keep that in mind and follow some key guidelines to basically avoid that situation.
Two variables we want to focus in on today, the first of which, dry soil conditions. And we have those in abundance, unfortunately, in Kansas yet. And those dry soils can truly affect anhydrous activity.
Absolutely. That's a key point. And this year, that's really one of the challenges. We have to keep in mind that essentially when we apply anhydrous ammonia, we basically need water for that ammonia to convert to ammonium. And the ammonium form is really the form of nitrogen that's going to be stable. It's going to basically stay in the soil. And so we do need to have water, basically moisture, for that conversion to happen. So that's one key aspect, that basically the chemistry of what's happening when we inject anhydrous ammonia in the soil. The presence of that water will basically convert to ammonium and keep that nitrogen in place. And when we have dry conditions, of course, that can limit that process. And obviously, we do have the risk of losing that nitrogen. So that's from the chemistry standpoint of what's happening there. Of course, we do have the physical property associated with dry soils as well. And that could be a big factor as well. And this is oftentimes just cloudy soil conditions that we have, essentially large spaces that left after we applied anhydrous, that essentially a situation where we can lose anhydrous immediately. And some of these may be happening a few hours after applications, and it can continue for several days. And again, during that time, we can lose significant amount of that anhydrous ammonia.
To the point of as much as 50% in some circumstances.
In some cases, yes, we can get to that point, and obviously affecting significantly the amount of nitrogen that will be available next year for that corn crop. So definitely something to keep in mind. In many cases, what we need to do is basically evaluate what is the condition in that specific field. Some fields are going to be different because texture is a big part of this as well. In some soils that are, depending on the texture we have, we may have more issues of losses. And so we basically need to evaluate every situation. If we think we are losing significant amount of anhydrous, if we are smelling ammonia essentially after application, that's always a good indicator. If that's happening, we either need to make some adjustments. Some of those adjustments may be injection at the depth of application. We can try to basically put deeper if all possible. And in some cases, we may just need to stop and wait for better soil conditions. Essentially, again, if we're going to be losing significant amounts, it's better just to wait and get some better conditions if we are not able to make adjustments.
So if one's to place their anhydrous deeper, we're talking several inches deeper than normal? What?
Typically, we want to be at least in the range of 6 to 8 inches, given the dry conditions that we have. We have to keep in mind that typically when we get to that depth, we tend to have a little bit more moisture, enough moisture to hold some of that, convert that ammonia into ammonium. And of course, also helping to minimize any of that loss with more shallow applications. So certainly try to hit at least 6 to 8 inches. In some cases, maybe need to be even deeper. And so those are some of the key conditions. The other thing is also just using things like these behind the knives, basically to seal the application point the best we can. All of those things will definitely improve and try to keep that anhydrous in place. So those are some of the key things we have to keep in mind. And like I say, some of these will vary a lot depending on the field, depending on the soil conditions we have. So we pretty much have to evaluate each field and see what is a challenge. And keep in mind that we can lose significant amount if we are not keeping that nitrogen in place.
Well, Dorivar, the other variable that will dictate whether or not anhydrous stays in place and is available to the crop, the soil temperature at application time. Talk about that, if you would.
Yes, that's another key point, and this is maybe a different aspect, really. The challenge right now with dry soils is really, do we have the conditions, the moisture, and do we have the physical properties to basically hold that anhydrous in place? But the next question is what happens with soil temperature and the potential for microbial activity, essentially for that nitrogen to convert to nitrate and potentially lose that nitrogen either by leaching or maybe even denitrification later on next spring. And so the question here is soil temperature. As we know, a microbial-driven process will be affected by temperature. And so we have to be looking at that very closely. Typically, the guideline says that we want to apply anhydrous after we get to a temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit or lower, a 4-inch depth in the soil. So we have to monitor that. We do have access, obviously, from the Kansas Mesonet, a network of weather stations where we are evaluating and monitoring soil temperature regularly. And that's an excellent tool that we can use. One thing that we have to keep in mind that typically when we talk about the soil temperature, we're really focusing on the average temperature in the last 7 days. So that 50 degrees is really the average temperature in the last week. Because we know temperature is going to change, vary from day to day. Overall, in the last week or two, we've been seeing a trend for significant decrease in temperature in the soil if we look at the mesonet. And in some cases, we are getting close to that 50 degrees. Certainly, the lower temperature in the last few days is helping. But it's still, again, in many cases, temperature in the soil may still be above 50. This is, again, very important as we are trying to keep that nitrogen available for next year. And this is often one of the challenges with anhydrous, fall anhydrous. In many cases, we say maybe we want to avoid anhydrous application in the fall because, remember, we're going to be planting corn in April, May perhaps, and so that nitrogen is going to be taken up pretty late next spring. So obviously we want to minimize any potential losses during the winter times. And again, soil temperature is a key point there that we have to keep an eye on.
And the prime objective here is to keep that product from nitrification. And that can be accomplished in part by using a nitrification inhibitor product along with that anhydrous.
Those are also definitely tools that we have available. One thing that we have to keep in mind is that depending on the winter, some years in Kansas we may have a little bit warmer temperatures and soil temperature maybe goes above 50 degrees. And that basically means there's going to be microbial activity happening there. And so other tools available to us, certainly using nitrification inhibitors can help us. Another way basically to slow down or even stop the nitrification process. Again, all that we're trying to do here is to keep the nitrogen in the ammonium form. We know the nitrogen in the ammonium form is stable. We're not going to lose that. If we do have nitrification, that nitrogen is going to go to nitrate, and we know that nitrate, we can leach that. We can have denitrification losses, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So certainly nitrification inhibitors, there are some in the market that are being evaluated. A lot of research over the years that can be very helpful. One thing that we have to keep in mind that some soils may benefit from this more than others. Some soils that we know are going to be prone to potential losses. Definitely we need to be thinking about nitrification inhibitors. Now, that we also do have many conditions in Kansas where soils are fine texture or deep soils, fairly dry conditions most of the winter months, that losses are going to be low. And so obviously in that kind of situation, we may not necessarily see that benefit from nitrification inhibitors. So again, how much benefit we'll see ultimately will also depend on what kind of soils we have.
And those coarse soils, sandy soils, they're typically not a good candidate for fall anhydrous application.
Yes, that's an excellent point. And again, there are some soils that has just much higher risk of nitrogen losses, and those are going to be the sandy soils. And again, for many reasons that we talk about today, moisture is one of those. Even right now with the dry conditions, sandy soils obviously tends to be much drier in many cases because it's not holding some of that moisture. But most importantly, also if we do have leaching potential for leaching, water moving through the soil later on, we can have significant leaching losses. So typically we'll say try to avoid sandy soils if all possible for anhydrous in the fall. I'll definitely target those soils for spring application of anhydrous, which will be ideal. But other soils, again, fine texture soils, medium texture soils, we do have the potential to basically have a successful program keeping nitrogen in place in most of our conditions in Kansas.
Very well. And in fact, in the recent Agronomy E-Update newsletter out of K-State, both of these aspects of applying anhydrous ammonia in the fall in advance of corn planting, dry soil conditions, soil temperature conditions, they're all covered in a pair of articles in that newsletter. Agronomy.ksu.edu is where you'll find that. It was posted this past Friday. Dorivar, thanks for the overview right here.
Thank you.
Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. He's a crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension. We'll return with more for you on this Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. Again, we're in our 96th year of broadcast service to agriculture in Kansas and the Central Plains. Eric Atkinson with you. Today's agricultural news headlines for you now, courtesy in part of DTN. The USDA's weekly crop progress and condition report for the state of Kansas reads like this. For the week ending this past Sunday, our soil moisture supplies, again, very thin. Topsoil moisture rated at 0% surplus, 23% adequate, and 77% short to very short as of this past weekend. Subsoil moisture at 0% surplus, 30% adequate, and 70% short to very short. The state of the Kansas winter wheat crop, 29% good to excellent this week, 47% fair, and 24% poor to very poor, with planting now 92% done. 82% is the 5-year average for the date. And wheat emergence in Kansas is at 70% now. That is ahead of the 60% average. Corn harvest, 85% complete now, ahead of the 79% average for the date. Soybean harvest, 78% in, well ahead of the 55% average. And the grain sorghum harvest at 64%, well ahead of the 46% average. Range and pasture conditions around the state, 27% good to excellent this week, 40% fair, and 33% poor to very poor. Now here's USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey on winter wheat planting progress and early crop conditions nationally.
Looking at winter wheat for the week ending October 25th, the vast majority of the crop has been planted, 85% on that date. That's ahead of the 5-year average of 80%, also ahead of last year's 83%. The major production areas of the Plains, Midwest, vast majority of the crop in the ground by late October. Winter wheat emergence, 62%. And although that's 2 points ahead of the 5-year average and 2 points ahead of last year's emergence, there are some local and state level signs of some issues related to drought. What I mean by that is if you look at the emergence numbers, they're at least 5 percentage points behind the respective 5-year averages in several states, Idaho, Montana, Nebraska, and Oregon. That is a combination of drought as well as the recent outbreak of bitterly cold weather that has slowed or halted winter wheat development. So something to watch as we move on through the fall and winter. Given all the drought across the western half of the country, we shouldn't be too surprised that it's not a very encouraging start. Only 41% of the winter wheat rated good to excellent in the initial report, 19% very poor to poor. This time a year ago, we had a better-looking crop that was 56% good to excellent and 13% very poor to poor. And the list of states with at least 1/5 of their wheat rated very poor to poor kind of reads like a who's who's list of where the drought is most extreme at this point. Colorado leads the nation, 31% very poor to poor. Other states in the category of seeing at least 1/5 of the wheat rated very poor to poor includes Oklahoma at 25%, Texas 27%, Kansas, the number one production state, at 24%, and both Oregon and Nebraska coming in at 21% very poor to poor. The only piece of good news there is that the Southern Plains, as we speak, starting to get some rain, sleet, freezing rain, and snow, and the moisture should be highly beneficial as we look forward from this point.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey there. And China has accelerated purchases of U.S. farm products last month, according to new data, but overall it remains behind on its overall commitment to buy about $140 billion in specific U.S. agricultural, energy, and manufactured goods this year. That's according to a report from the Peterson Institute for International Economics made yesterday. Now it's on to this week's Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning some of the changes we're seeing in the protein markets. I think most of you are probably aware that in the last 6 weeks or so we've added probably about 25% to the price of soybean meal. Several things going on as we look worldwide. We've got some drought conditions in Brazil that's making the Brazilian crop questionable as we move into 2021. So That's putting some pressure on the market, and we also had some issues with maybe the carryover supply from our 2019 harvest that are also putting some pressure on. The good news is we've had dry weather across most of the Midwest, or the area where we actually grow soybeans here in the United States. So harvest has come along quite nicely, although in some areas yields maybe were a little lower than what people were hoping for. So as we look at total soybean supply and we look forward to the next 6 to probably 12 months in the marketing year, we probably need to be concerned about what's going to happen to the price of protein in our dairy diets. So, time to sharpen your pencils, time to get with your nutritionist and start to think about some options. I want to just throw a few things on the table to think about. Right now, our alfalfa hay market here in Kansas is fairly stable, and we're averaging about $1 per point of RFV when we look at the price per ton, sometimes maybe just a little bit more. If soybean meal prices stay up, or if they increase to levels above where they're at currently, I would expect the hay market to edge up a little bit as well. But you might want to visit with your nutritionist about where the price point actually is for including more alfalfa into the diet of your dairy animals based on the price of protein. Some other things that you might want to visit with your nutritionist about are some of the various byproducts that we tend to use for protein sources that come from, say, the corn milling industry. So when you think about distillers' grains, we think about even things like dry corn gluten feed or wet corn gluten feed. Those may be pricing in at a different level. Keep in mind that as protein prices, particularly soybean meal prices, increase, those prices will probably follow, but they may be at a little bit slower rate than the increase that we're seeing in the current soybean meal market. Some other things to think about is how you might contract ahead to try to stabilize that price, or how you might use hedging. If you're going to do that, again, encourage you to visit with someone who has some expertise in that area to help you with those decisions. Some other things that you might consider as these meal prices increase and the cost of protein increases in our dairy diets may be possible, but that some of our bypass, our rumen-protected amino acids come into play. Again, you need to visit with your nutritionist to see what the options are to protect yourself as much as you can as you see an increase in the cost of protein to supply to your dairy animals. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike, and you're listening to Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
We're back now on Agriculture Today, and alongside once more is Charlie Lee, Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, our weekly visit on wildlife management. And you've a look for us today, Charlie, at the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and there are steps to overhaul that act, which we'll get into. But tell us more about what that particular legislation is all about.
The Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Migratory Bird Conservation Act are kind of the centerpieces of U.S. Fish and Wildlife law that protects migratory birds. Migratory birds are protected not only under federal law, but also under international treaties with Canada and Mexico. And that law prohibits the take of migratory birds. Now, take is defined fairly broadly, and it's the subject of lots of different court opinions. And unfortunately, taking of birds can be interpreted as just killing the birds, whether it's incidental or it's a deliberate action. So as we approach the end of this presidential administration's first term, there's been a stated attempt to reduce regulatory burden on agencies, primarily on those agencies that impact industry and utilities. And part of that has been the development of defining what this incidental take may be, and some conservation agencies see this as an attempt to reduce compliance with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. When we look at the threats to migratory birds, however, we know that cats kill about 2.5 billion birds per year. Collisions with building glass can kill 600 million birds a year. Collisions with vehicles can kill 200 million birds per year. Chemical poisoning with pesticides and other toxins can kill an estimated 70 million birds a year. Collisions with electric lines is 25 million birds a year. Collisions with communication towers kill 6 million birds a year. Electrocution kills another 6 million birds a year. Oil pits kill 50,000 birds a year, and collisions with wind turbines may kill 200,000 birds a year. Those are the top threats to birds. That's not incidental take. Those are very defined threats that should be addressed. It's killing massive numbers of birds, and perhaps we need to look at measures to reduce those impacts. But what the administration has done seems to have circumvented the process, and it's caused some controversy. A solicitor's opinion has developed some changes that reduced incidental take protections. So the administration started a draft environmental impact statement, as this would have to undergo. Now have sent that draft environmental impact statement out for review and are in the process of developing a final environmental impact statement. Conservation agencies are concerned that this environmental impact statement, or the draft, was only 86 pages in length, where an average length of a draft environmental impact statement is more than 580 pages. So they consider that this was a lack of review, and it does not allow for a significant analysis of the impacts of the alternatives to this administrative action. A recent U.S. District Court decision overturned that 2017 solicitor opinion and reinstated these incidental take protections, leaving this proposed rule in limbo. And this district court opinion is expected to be appealed by the administration, but whether that will happen this year or early next year is yet to be decided.
So, to be clear, the move here is to take the incidental take provisions basically out of the Act, and the consequences may not be favorable to species. Is that the perception here?
Yeah, it's that there could be more birds lost because of changes in the law, and that it weakens existing conservation measures. The phrase incidental take doesn't appear in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act or in the regulations that implement that act. Incidental take is the take of migratory birds that directly results from, but it's not the purpose of the activity. The manual then further defines the term kill to include any action that directly and foreseeably causes the death of a migratory bird, where the migratory bird is not the purpose of the action. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act has been modified and amended numerous times in its history. I see this as another case that perhaps can be improved, but I also am a firm believer that the process of review of draft environmental impact statements need to be thorough so that we get all opinions and all of the science out there to look at. And this particular act seems to be shortening that process and has caused more than a little bit of concern among conservation agencies.
One would likely presume, Charlie, then this will be contested for a while. This issue will go back and forth for some time.
I suspect that it will be contested in courts for several years. We know that migratory birds are a very culturally and economically important species. There's a lot of bird watchers in the United States. They contribute a lot to the economic vitality There's a lot of bird hunters in the United States. Birds do some good things in assisting agricultural production by consuming insect pests. Early on, overhunting was the cause of many of the species declines. As we see when I listed those current causes of migratory bird losses, overhunting is not the issue now. It's some of those other activities that perhaps need some sideboards on to reduce some of those losses.
Well, again, there is a move afoot to amend the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and we'll address, if it goes through, incidental take as a provision of that act, and we will see how this pans out. Charlie, thanks for the update right here. Wildlife Specialist Charlie Lee, K-State Research and Extension. And once again, our time is away. We appreciate you tuning in. And please rejoin us right here tomorrow, won't you? Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.